Hi, guys. I've never moderated something in this room before. It's always been the other one back there, so this is new. I like the stadium-style seating, though. This is good. I can see all of you. Hi. So this is Frank from QED, who, I don't think I'd even heard of you up until 2 years ago, and then it was like, why have you not talked to this guy? Like, he was an early investor in SoFi, Nubank, Credit Karma, like all of these firms that weren't necessarily monsters back in the day, but today they're some of the household names in fintech. So I was very glad that I got chosen to moderate this conversation with you. And if you have not checked out his blog yet, Fintech Junkie is what it is, right? There's a lot of really interesting musings he does on there. So when we were brainstorming ideas, I kind of went through, read the last few posts, and there was something that came up. I forget which one exactly it was in, but challenger banks. And just given how the past year, you've seen a number of them take off, Nubank, Chime, others over in Europe. But you've also seen some of the big behemoths struggle to get into this with last week, I believe it was, JP Morgan closing down Fin, its form of a sort of challenger digital bank. And I want to just get your thoughts of, like, where do you see this segment going? Like, we've started to see it climb a little bit. Online stuff has been around for a while, but this has started to sort of become more mature and sort of have its moment a little bit. So where do you see this going from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with the fact that, a core checking account is an incredibly useful, incredibly valuable vehicle that just about everybody needs. And if you don't have a checking account, life is really difficult. Mm-hmm. So you're starting with a product that's important to just about every consumer in the US and in most of the developed countries. And if you think about it, it's flexible because you can store money, you can move money, you can get cash, you can turn digits into cash or turn cash into digits. You can go online. It helps you with currency exchange. I mean, it's an incredibly, incredibly valuable and flexible product. And if you think about the past 15, 20, 30 years, there hasn't been that much innovation in the core checking account. Mm-hmm. You can actually point at the big innovations that created a lot of adoption or change. When ATM machines, first came about, like that completely transformed the usefulness of a checking account. Right? All of a sudden, you had access to Visa and MasterCard rails with your money. You were able to get money without having to walk into a branch. So, I mean, it became more useful. Same thing with online account servicing, same thing with remote check deposit. Like, there are 3 or 4 big innovations that have taken place in the core checking account market. And I think we're poised for another whole series of innovations. And I think whenever there's new technology and new innovation, you have to ask yourself who's best positioned to take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. Is it the core incumbents, or is there a chance for someone new to actually come in and disrupt? And I think that's really what's happening now is, there's at least one line of thinking that says the new people are more likely to disrupt with the innovation that's coming rather than the incumbents.
Why can't the incumbents just try to start innovating themselves? They obviously all have a lot of money, and I think we've learned some lessons from why JP Morgan's experiment didn't necessarily work out. In their mind, they learned a lot from it. So it's not necessarily a total failure to them, but it obviously did not work out as they planned it to.
Yeah, I think it starts with what you want to accomplish, right? And if you don't know what you want to accomplish, it's really hard to put a learning agenda together, to go attack it. And when you talk about innovation, it's about taking a problem that's hopefully profound, and it hurts a lot of people, and trying to solve that problem. And if you look at Fin and some of the other incumbents, when they think about innovation, mm-hmm. a lot of it really is a wrapper around the core technology and user experience that they already have. And that's not innovation, which means that you're not solving a profound problem, and that means that it's hard to get people, to change from the product they're already using, or for new people in the market to adopt your product. So a lot of Fin was about putting kind of a digital wrapper around a technology stack that already existed, with functionality that already existed, and going through channels that they were experimenting with, but by and large, they found their own customers, right? Because the functionality was just about the same as the core account. Mm-hmm. You contrast that to some of the challenger banks where there's new functionality that's coming in. So, players like Chime and one of our portfolio companies, Current, they have functionality where people can get access to their payroll, multiple days before they would if they deposit it using a core checking account at one of the incumbents.
Right, with little risk to those portfolio companies that you mentioned, since you do have this understanding that, like, hey, they get paid every single week after week.
It's ACH is slow, ACH is broken, if you actually think about people wanting money now. And a lot of these challenger banks are saying this is a value proposition which is valuable enough to enough people that we can offer it, we can attract new people in, it's a different user experience, new functionality, and it works. You can also look at, again, Current is one of our companies, but there are a lot of other companies that are segmenting the core checking account so that you might have users of the account and fiduciaries of the account. And they have different views, different controls, different ways of using the money in the account. So with Current, they have a parent-teen account, and the teenager, has certain ability to use the card. And you've got the parent who has a lot of transparency into where the card is being used, controls in place about spending, saving, and charitable giving. And the fiduciary is different than the user of the account. And that's new functionality and new innovation, that's giving people an excuse to try a new card.
Right. And I like that you point out, whenever I've switched bank accounts in the past, it's always been like I'm walking down the street in New York City and I see this big ad like, switch to Citi and get a $400 bonus for switching over here. It's never about like, we have better technology, we have a better value proposition. It's just like, hey, you'll get $400 if you stay with us for 2 months afterwards.
Yep.
So it's interesting. I'm sure customer acquisition cost is still high for everyone in this area, whether you're a fintech or an incumbent, but it's just a different strategy in terms of what you're telling people the reason is to come use us versus someone else.
Yeah, maybe I'm too simplistic on this, but I actually believe that most consumers are rational, right? They make decisions based on things they care about. And when you're dealing with really complicated products that have lots of different dimensions to them, you'd have to be foolish to believe the answer is to be above average on everything, right? How many people buy a car and say, I bought it because it's a little bit above average on how it handles, a little bit above average on the stereo, a little bit above average on the tire? You don't buy that way. What you do is you figure out the 1 or 2 things that matter to you most, and you look for the best product and hope that all of the other characteristics are good enough.
Right.
So, one of the problems with the core banking ecosystem today, the incumbents, is that they're using these digital wrappers to distribute, commoditized or, pretty mediocre products. And I think what a lot of the neobanks or, it doesn't even have to be in core checking, it could be in some of the other products. They're trying to figure out for a subset of customers, what is the thing they care about most, and give it to them. Right? And you might end up making your money in a very different way on the back end on something they don't care as much about. So you're seeing a lot of these new core checking accounts say, look, you can save more money if you come with us, 2.5%. You're seeing functionality like get your money early. These are dimensions that actually matter to some segment of the population. And then all of the other components, it's just the wrapper, right? It's kind of table stakes and expectations that you're at least good on all of the other dimensions.
Yeah, so some venture capitalists have been investing in this area as just like a theme play. Like DST has done a number of bets on different challenger or neobanks, not necessarily thinking that every single one of them is going to succeed, but making this bet that like, hey, at least 1, if not 2 of them should do really well if this is a thing, and we'll pay off our fund via that way. It sounds like you've been a little bit more strategic in picking select ones to actually go invest in, whether it be like in a certain geography or with a certain value proposition. So what are you taking into account when looking at different players in this space to actually put money to work for?
Yeah, I could play out the 2 very different ways of thinking about these companies. One way of thinking about it is if you stare at some of the most valuable companies on the face of the planet, they have something in common, which is when they were small, they were able to originate a lot of customers almost for free and have very high engagement rates with them where their net promoter scores are through the roof, right? So they did something right to attract massive numbers of users at very low cost. And a lot of these businesses figured out how to monetize later, right? They worried more about the user experience. They worried more about engagement. They worried about basically catalyzing them to do something, right? And if you can amass enough of them eventually you figure out a business model that works. So that's one way of attacking the space. And you can see some of the hyper-growth companies that are out there, they have these characteristics. The other way of thinking about it is, if you don't learn to monetize early on, you might end up with customers that don't monetize, or you're going to have to disappoint them at some point when you start charging for something that you didn't charge for in the past. So you almost have to ask yourself, when do you start trying to monetize? When do you figure out if this user base will monetize? And I think there's been a sea change in how a lot of the younger consumers think about products. Like, they're more than willing to pay for something that has value. So this idea of just give it away for free and figure it out later, you don't necessarily have to do that anymore. A lot of the newer, call it fintech apps, right? So the applications that are out there that people are downloading on their phones, they resemble Spotify, or they resemble Netflix in terms of membership fees. If someone finds enough value in it, they're willing to pay $3 or $5 a month to get access to whatever the service is. So, learning how to monetize early on is a very different way of scaling your business, because, even $1, $2, or $3 per customer per month, it transforms the economics. And it actually helps you scale a lot faster because you have money coming back.
Right.
So two very different theories. We're a little bit more in the second camp than the first camp, but both are, equally valid in their own ways. It's a matter of what you want to learn when.
Got it. Do you think there's a certain geography that is more poised to see one of these challenger banks really take off versus others? Because there's certain countries where I feel like the banking system maybe is, more broken or less, capable of serving the people in that said country.
Yeah, we're very active investors in Latin America. So in Latin America, we have Nubank, which we're fortunate to be part of that story. And I think it's a great example of how you can start from, solving a profound pain point within an underserved customer base and very quickly grow to, I think they're the 6th largest bank in Brazil at this point, only 5 years in. So it's amazing how...
Largest in terms of what? Deposits, customer base?
Number of customers.
Okay.
So it's a very interesting company and an example of how you can, really find a profound problem in an underserved community. And if you have a better product, the product flies off the shelf. And they're going to be opening up in Mexico and some other areas as well. So that whole region of the world, I think, is very interesting. And we have, I think, 16 investments in Latin America that are playing out this theme of, a lot of segments being underserved in lending and in core banking. But as QED, we're hands-on investors, so we have to choose our geographies wisely because we spend a lot of time. And we focused on the US, the UK, and Latin America, but it doesn't mean there aren't other areas of the world that are ripe for disruption.
Got it. Yeah. How do you think, speaking of different areas of the world, each one has a different monetization style starting out? So in the US, it's a lot of taking advantage of the ones that under Durbin are exempt from like the interchange, where they get a higher portion of that fee back. It's actually, I forget what the exact numbers are, but it's a drastic difference. So players like Chime, SoFi, others are getting a lot on each debit card transaction swipe, whereas in the UK, that's not a thing. And I'm not extremely familiar with what it is in Latin America, since I've spent less time focusing on that area, but I would assume, again, it's some sort of different monetization effort. How do you see that evolving in each sort of country, and like what would be other monetization plays that they could add into that?
Yeah, this is a somewhat controversial opinion, but I believe that, just being on one side of the balance sheet is not sustainable in the long run. So at the end of the day, gathering deposits and figuring out how to monetize through interchange is a nice revenue stream if you can make it work. But ultimately, you've got to worry about how sustainable it is, because someone else can come in who plays on both sides of the balance sheet and decide that the one side of the balance sheet is a great acquisition strategy and end up giving the customer back a lot of that interchange in terms of rewards or in terms of other features and functionality that if you're not playing on both sides of the balance sheet, you can't afford. So you've seen this play out in credit cards, as an example, where interchange is very high and a lot of the interchange is given back to consumers or small business owners as a way of attracting them into the franchise in the first place. And then you make margin, through other methods.
And this is mostly a US thing so far, right? Because interchange in the UK is obviously different, so rewards aren't that big of a thing.
They're
over
not
there
that big,
versus
which
here.
means you actually do have to be good at the lending side of the equation. You know, I mean, the adage in banking is you're borrowing money from people, that's your raw material, and then you're lending it back to them or other customers in your franchise for margin, right? I mean, your net interest margin is about 50% of all of the revenue, and in fact, more of the risk-adjusted profit in banking. The other half, it's fees of one form or fashion. And those fees are split up in so many different product lines that, you know, really it's the net interest margin that's driving a lot of the profitability of the banks.
Got it. Now, given that, going back to Fin not working out as planned, do you think that makes it so the challenger banks don't have to worry as much about what the incumbents are going to do? Or do you think it's sort of like, hey, this one first experiment didn't really work out, but that doesn't mean Citi, someone else is going to come in and try again and do a better job than what JP Morgan did? Or JP Morgan does it again in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more interested in seeing the banks that are taking a vertical focus and almost declaring that they're not going to be all things to all people at all times through all channels. Like, that is a bankrupt strategy. Strategy is as much about what you aren't doing as what you are doing. And I think one of the fallacies in banking is that you can have, you know, 200 or 300 products and actually manage them well. And a lot of the banks that I talk to believe they have to actually run, you know, that complete a product suite because they're in people's backyards and they don't know who they are, and they're going to come into the bank and expect, you know, a full suite of banking services. But the banks that are going to take more of a vertical focus or split up their businesses so that they have P&L managers that are trying to focus on a narrower set of products, they have a better chance of success. And I think that understanding, you know, both sides of the balance sheet for a vertical is a really, really powerful thing. And I think you're going to start to see some small business banks emerge. You're going to see, we're actually backing a bank focused on landlords. You're going to see some of these vertical opportunities where you might only need to be good at 5 or 6 products, but you can be world-class at those 5 or 6 products, integrate them so they all talk to each other, and then you actually understand the customer.
Got it. Do you think some fintechs are trying to rebundle too quickly and do too much rebundling then? Because I feel like everyone kind of wants to just start doing all of this now.
Yeah, I mean, too quickly is relative. If anyone who tries to do too much is probably going to stub their toe at some point. It's just hard to do a lot. But a middleware layer is emerging, and that middleware layer is really kind of the connector of all the Lego blocks between the banks and anyone who wants to connect into the banking ecosystem. So the middleware layer is still young, but you're seeing players like Camber and SnapsFi and some others that are out there that are making it much easier to actually launch products. And I think that's only going to continue. I mean, the Plaids and the Quovos and others of the world are starting to get significant traction, and it's making it much, much easier to build products.
Got it. All right, so I don't think I explained this to you backstage. They do this every year where you kind of close out with, you simply say overrated or underrated when I say something. And I laugh because 2 of these things I already know what your answer to are based on what we said backstage. First one, cryptocurrency.
Overrated to
Blockchain.
a very large extreme.
Yeah.
Blockchain, I mean, I think it's an interesting technology, but there are no use cases right now that are interesting.
So maybe slightly overrated, but not as overrated as what cryptocurrency is.
I think it's a little ahead of its time.
Okay, that's fair. Amazon.
It's hard to say underrated because everyone loves them, but I think they're underrated.
Okay. PayPal.
Underrated.
There. Andreessen Horowitz.
I love them. So. They're great.
IPOs in general. That's been a really big thing this year.
Yeah, it has. I actually think the public markets add a layer of discipline that, you know, more companies should unfortunately run after. It's hard.
Right. Fintech unicorns. This is a very broad statement. You have many that are portfolio companies that are unicorns, so be careful. But there's also a number that you probably think are overrated.
Yeah, it's hard because I think in fintech you're attacking such amazingly large revenue and profit streams that you can build some gigantic businesses. So I think there's plenty of room for more billion-dollar plus companies to emerge, but I'd like to see more billion-dollar plus profitable companies.
Got it. Okay. And then this is a broader statement with about 15 seconds to go. Which area of fintech do you think is the most underrated right now?
The connectivity layer.
So like the Plaid Quovo type thing.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll have Beth Pinsker coming up for the next panel then. Thank you, guys.